Started. I want to welcome everybody to our annual Evelyn F. McKnight Brain Institute lecture. And it is our pleasure to have as today's speaker, Dr. Jide Williams from Columbia. So Dr. Williams obtained his medical degree from the University of Lagos, Nigeria, and a master's degree from the Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health in New York City. He is currently a tenured professor of neurology, chief of staff in the Department of Neurology, and associate dean of community research at Columbia University. He is a global leader in racial health disparities with emphasis on community-placed behavioral stroke interventions, principal investigator of multiple NIH Investigator Awards, and co-chair of Columbia University's Anti-Racism Task Force. Author of numerous peer-reviewed articles, Dr. Williams has received many prestigious awards, including the European Stroke Research Foundation Investigator of the Year Award, Columbia University Outstanding Teacher of the Year Award, the National Humanism and Medicine Award from the AAMC, American Heart Association Trailblazer Award, Fast Company Most Creative 100 list, and has been a regular feature of the annual New York Magazine Best Doctors list. He is a founder and president of Hip Hop Public Health, a nationally recognized nonprofit corporation that leverages music, art, and science for health promotion. So if I'm hearing some background noise, so please put yourself on. Okay. And I want to ask people to put their questions.
We can't hear you.
Okay, yeah, my computer just did. Thank you, Toby. So today, Dr. Williams will be talking about racial disparities in stroke. So why is this relevant to the UAB McKnight Brain Institute's emphasis on mitigating age-related memory loss? It is because cognitive decline and stroke share common risk factors, and both are critical indices of failed brain health. So when we hear that there are barriers in achieving primary and secondary stroke prevention, they apply equally well to the preservation and restitution of cognition. And the impact bears on both who we treat and get data from, and who is doing the treating and conducting the research. To overcome such barriers, we need to listen, learn, and then engage in important conversations. Today's talk is a step in this process. And so without further ado, please welcome Dr. Jide Williams, whose talk is entitled Racism and Stroke Disparities, Centering the Margins. Jide, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ron, for that introduction. And thank you to all my friends out there. I've worked with many of you in the past, and I hope to work with some of you going forward. I'm going to share my screen. As Ron mentioned, the title of my talk is Racism and Black and White Stroke Disparities in America. So these are my disclosures. So I want to start by, as Ron mentioned, centering the margins, which is a terminology from the public health critical race practice. I want to introduce Daquan, who is a fifth grader in East New York. And he comes from a very impoverished part of town. If some of you don't know East New York, he comes from a high crime neighborhood. He's exposed to violence. He has a single mother who has violent boyfriends. His mother is often depressed and she abuses substances. The local school that he attends is a failing school, and he's struggling to keep up even in that failing environment. He feels racism wherever he goes. Indeed, about 1 in 5 African-American fifth graders report perceived racism. He's often hungry. He thanks God for the school lunch program, and his mother collects SNAP benefits that helps put food on that table. His brother was incarcerated, came back from Rikers Island. Unfortunately, due to NYCHA rules here in New York City, you're not allowed, formerly incarcerated individuals are not allowed to live in-house NYCHA residence. And so his brother was caught living back at home. They were evicted from the housing project and ended up spending a lot of time in the shelter system. I want to say that this is not an atypical story from kids that come from these communities. And what's often most remarkable to me is the resilience that these kids acquire as they progress through life. And so what are these adverse childhood experiences? Well, adverse childhood experiences are traumatic experiences that disrupt a child's development. And there are 10 of them broken into 3 broad categories: abuse, which could be physical, emotional, or sexual; neglect, physical and emotional; and household dysfunction. So if you look at Daquan's experiences, he has a mother with depression and substance abuse, an incarcerated older brother. He watches his mother get beaten at home. He's emotionally neglected. He's physically neglected. And fortunately for him, he hasn't been sexually abused. But you can see, if you look at the number of ACEs that Daquan has, he has at least 7 of these ACEs. And so as we look at ACEs, it's important to look at them in the context of this paired approach, which is combining adverse childhood experiences with adverse community experiences. And this tree is a really nice analogy of how one can view this. So if you imagine that the leaves on the tree represent the symptoms of ACEs, and these can be recognized fairly easily in clinical, educational, and social service settings, such as a well child visit or a preschool classroom. Imagine that this tree is planted in poor soil. And the reason why the soil is poor is because it's steeped in systemic inequities, the degree of which are often not appreciated by many. And these inequities, community disruption, lack of opportunity, economic mobility, social capital, poor housing, et cetera. This poor soil robs the tree of the nutrients it requires to thrive until it begins to wither and die. But these adverse community environments didn't appear out of nowhere. They actually extend back to slavery, when structures of racism were erected initially to maintain white supremacy, then post-emancipation to maintain white privilege. A lot of these really evolved into the Jim Crow laws, which, as we know, championed and laid out the rules of segregation. We know the impact of redlining on economic growth. And we know that all these injustices that were legalized at the time targeted Black people. And what it did by targeting Black people is that it marginalized Black people, marginalized their communities, and it concentrated poverty and these social determinants of health that we talk about. So these adverse community environments emerged from this system, that the residue of which we still see today: poor access to healthcare, poor housing conditions, poor physical environment, poorly funded school. And I just want to remind everyone that schools are generally, at least 50% of funding for schools generally come from local taxes. And so if you're living in an impoverished neighborhood, those local taxes are not going to be, are not going to be sufficient to adequately resource fit a school. So one of the reasons why certain public schools in certain neighborhoods are much better equipped, are much better resourced than certain public schools in other neighborhoods. It's to do with the way these schools are funded. And then there's the poor access to capital, which really did emerge from direct redlining laws with regards to federally mortgage-backed insurances. But this trend has continued even to this day. So if you look at this de jure segregation that occurred as a result of this legalized racism, and you look at what's happening today, we've kind of evolved from de jure to de facto segregation. There is no law segregating America right now, but there is de facto segregation. In fact, if you look at the segregation index, and David Williams at Harvard likes to talk about the segregation index, if you look at the segregation index, it really hasn't improved appreciably since apartheid South Africa. Apartheid South Africa back in the early 90s had a segregation index of about 90. If you look at New York City, where I am today, it's about 82% today. And across America, it's about 60% for many cities. And so there is still de facto segregation, and this enables marginalization and deprivation of these communities from accessing the type of resources, or from the type of resources flowing into these communities that ultimately causes the type of food deserts and lack of economic opportunities that we see within these communities. So this marginalization that we see today, you can trace a line directly back to de jure segregation. And what that has done, it creates that poor soil that I talked about, the inequities within the soil out of which these children grow. And this poor soil, this adverse community environment, is one of the big drivers for the type of toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences that we see in many Black neighborhoods. In fact, the worst conditions under which the poorest whites live is on average better than the best conditions under which the poorest Black lives. And we know this by looking at poverty concentration data. And so these ACEs, there are a number of studies that are out there today, but the CDC has done a lot of work on this, showing a dose-dependent relationship between these ACEs and chronic disease. The higher the ACE scores, the more likely an individual is to have a chronic disease in adulthood, and this includes stroke. It also includes a whole host of psychiatric conditions and maladaptive behaviors. What's interesting is that there's increasing data showing a relationship between ACE scores and brain development. Less gray matter has been seen in key brain areas, specifically the prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and hippocampus, in those children with high ACE scores. Weaker neural connections has been seen between the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. There have been epidemic shifts that have been reported, and there's greater erosion of telomeres, which we've also seen. And all of this data, we're seeing more and more emerge in the literature as we're understanding more the relationship between toxic stress in childhood and brain development. And so this adverse community environment, this soil, is it really an important target for our efforts? And one of the classic studies that was published in the New England Journal is the so-called Move to Opportunity study that was done by Jens Ludwig and his colleagues. And what they did is that it was a randomized social experiments to really look at these neighborhood effects on health. And they, in partnership with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, they baselined about 4,500 Black and Hispanic women with their children who were living in public housing in high poverty urban census tracts to one of three groups, baseline around 1994, and these individuals were followed between 1994 and 1998, and they were followed over a 10-year period. They were randomized to receive either special low poverty Section 8 vouchers, which were only redeemable if the individual moved to a more affluent neighborhood, or they received regular unrestricted Section 8 vouchers, or the control group that was offered neither. When they followed these individuals over these 10 years, they looked at measures of height, weight, hemoglobin A1C, and other anthropometric measures, and they showed that among those who moved from a high poverty neighborhood to a low poverty neighborhood, from a poor neighborhood to a more affluent neighborhood, we saw a 50% reduction in the likelihood of diabetes and a 40% reduction in extreme obesity. What was interesting in a follow-up paper that was published later in Science, that there were also positive effects seen on happiness and well-being. And among kids who moved before age 13 from a high poverty project to a project in an affluent community, they found that there were increased rates of college attendance among these kids, but there was no benefit, no effect on economic self-sufficiency and employment prospects. And so as Daquan gets older, he begins to assimilate the generational trauma that's handed down from parents and grandparents. His role models tend to be more negative within his community. He has negative experiences with law enforcement. At the time in New York City, there was a stop and frisk laws, and young Black men were being pulled over. Data has shown often for no good reason other than the color of their skin. And so he develops increased anxiety with his increased experiences with everyday racism. And this translates into toxic habits and toxic levels of stress. You know, a colleague of mine, Al Kohal, who runs Project Stay here at Columbia, randomly evaluated about 271 young men in Brooklyn, age 18 to 24, and found that 72% of them were arrested in the past year, 60% of them were beaten, 40% robbed, 39% like Daquan had witnessed domestic violence. And his point was really showing the risk of PTSD among these young men, and how these experiences translated into real behavioral maladaptive behaviors. The Everyday Discrimination Scale is a scale that was developed by David Williams, and it's just a scale that looks at interpersonal racism, and the questions themselves seem rather don't by themselves seem severe, but if you experience them every day, being treated with less courtesy, less respect, not people being scared of you, if you experience these every day, the sheer weight of volume of the frequency of the experience actually translates into more hypertension, more inflammation, and premature death. And David's published a lot about these associations with everyday discrimination. And the one thing I just want to talk a little bit more about is the fear, the people acting as if they are afraid of you, as if they are afraid of these young Black men. There have been a number of fMRI studies that really looked at the threat of unfamiliarity. They've generally looked at the anterior cingulate cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the fusiform face area, but most of the work has been really done in the amygdala, which we know is involved in the unconscious processing of stimuli that have acquired emotional significance. So in Elizabeth Phelps's study, white subjects were shown familiar and unfamiliar Black and white faces. And while in the MRI, they were to indicate by pressing a button whether the face was the same or was different. These individuals also had baseline implicit association tests and the modern racism scale, and they were also had, as a follow-up, the eye blink startle response. And what was found is that in response to unfamiliar Black faces, a strange Black face, there was intense amygdala activation, as well as a greater startle reflex that was seen. And this correlated not with the modern racism scale, which is really a measure of explicit bias, but it did correlate with the implicit association test, which is a measure of implicit bias. What was interesting is that these responses were only seen with unfamiliar Black faces and not with familiar Black faces. And there was no response with white faces, whether they were familiar or unfamiliar. You know, Teltz did a similar study with kids aged 4 to 16 and found that the differential amygdala responses to Black faces didn't appear until around age 14. And he also found that the greater childhood interracial contact diminished these amygdala responses to Black faces. What was sad was that both Black and white children showed similar increases over time to Black faces, consistent with research showing that Black kids internalize these socially constructed views that are held by the dominant culture. A white privilege measure was developed by Peggy McIntosh, and the term white privilege often evokes great defensiveness, but I just want to emphasize that white privilege does not mean your life has not been hard. What it means is that your skin color isn't one of the things making life harder. And so individuals learn racism and prejudice through exposure to events by either experiencing them personally or observing them. And the perspective that they form is really vulnerable to confirmation bias. Sometimes the greatest confirmation, the greatest exposure to confirmation bias comes from the media and not from direct experiences or experiences of loved ones. And it's constantly reinforced, through these continual verbal and visual cues, or real cues. And this perspective, is embraced by the dominant culture. Once it becomes embraced by the dominant culture, sadly, it becomes a social norm, and that social norm might be conscious, or it might be implicit. But the good news is that these effects can be reversed if the same person goes on to experience positive associations with people of the other race. And this applies to sexual orientation and other types of biases. And so toxic stress really occurs when an individual faces threats but lacks sufficient resources to respond to these threats. And if you can imagine Daquan's environment and the resources in his environment, it's not surprising that toxic stress is at epidemic levels in many of these communities, and it's not being addressed. These are the effects of perceived racism. I mentioned that as young as fifth graders, 1 in 5 have perceived racism. The effects of microaggressions, which are often unconscious, and the effect of chronic discrimination. More and more papers are coming out showing toxic stress's relationship with early onset cardiovascular disease, increased ambulatory blood pressure. We're now seeing more robustly a failure of nocturnal dipping in patients who have toxic stress. And we're also seeing not just the increased cardiovascular reactivity, but a delayed return to pre-stress levels. This was the work that was done by Bill Guerin and his colleagues. And this can also be mediated by rumination. There's increasing literature about this weathering hypothesis, papers emerging about whether it explains the excess disparity gaps that we see. There's the chronological versus the biological age. If you look at Daquan's evolution, that's a 61-year-old picture of Daquan. The biological age just really refers to the social and environmental influences on health, from conception to your chronological age. And if you look at the theory behind weathering, it really is related to the effect of chronic psychosocial stresses on your hypothalamic pituitary axis and your sympathetic adrenal medullary system, and that overactivation of those systems, that overactivity of those systems in the constant milieu of fight and flight and anxiety, causing an over-secretion of stress hormones, in turn causing physiological dysfunction that's hypothesized to cause more disease. And so as Daquan gets older, he is in his church where he feels safe in his church. The church is a great sanctuary and refuge for African Americans. And he goes to his church, and there are a lot of church health fairs that take place. And community health workers in his church ministry are doing screening events. And he's really never had any encounters with physicians, has really never been to the doctor. And his blood pressure is found to be 240/140. He is taken to the emergency room by a community health worker. He really didn't want to go because he had no symptoms, but he trusted his community health worker, who was part of the church, and followed him to the emergency room. There he was diagnosed with hypertension, severe hypertension. His creatinine was elevated. He had a emergency Medicaid application filled out by his social worker because he didn't have insurance. He's admitted to the hospital. While in the hospital, he has a silently traumatizing experience. He feels really uncomfortable just by the environment itself. He feels unseen. He feels unheard. He feels misunderstood. He experiences microaggressions. His experience just leads him to even further distrust the system and be even more suspicious of the opposite race. And this could have all been mitigated by trauma-informed care, by care that's been informed not just by trauma, but that's informed through a racial equity lens. He's then discharged. He's poorly literate, and he's discharged on polypharmacy for his blood pressure because it required multiple medications to bring under control. Some of them are TID, some of them are BID, some of them are QD. The nurse educates him and asks him if he understands. He nods, but he really doesn't really understand, and he's discharged on polypharmacy. A few weeks later, he has transient monocular blindness of his left eye, of his left eye, that lasts just several minutes. And he didn't think anything of it, didn't recognize, didn't know what was happening to him. And then later that same evening, he has transient speech dysfunction. And this was accompanied by right arm weakness. But again, he wasn't really sure what was going on, didn't recognize his stroke symptoms, and he thought nothing of it and went to bed. Unfortunately, Daquan woke up with a severe syndrome. 911 was called by a neighbor who comes to visit him every morning. He is rushed to the hospital, and he's found to have an ICA occlusion. And by the time he really gets to the hospital, he had herniated and lost his brainstem reflexes. And he was only 61 years old. But what are we doing about the millions of Daquans in America? I just want to emphasize that the problem is not race. The problem is the racialized experience. In fact, I'm on a mission to address this problem, because often in medicine we use race as a manipulable variable, but it's not race that's going to give us insights into what's going on. It's the racialized experience, and measures of that racialized experience are available and should be included in our studies. If we, again, I'm in the presence of George and Virginia, so, but this was a study out of their shop that really showed that, you know, as you get younger, these disparities, not just in mortality, but also in incidence, widen to the extent that when you're 45 or 54 as a Black individual, you know, the hazard ratio is close to 4. When you get above 85, there is an attenuation that it's probably an artifact of selective survival. And so you see widening disparities the younger we go. And so you start seeing young African-Americans who should be in the prime of their life experiencing strokes at higher rates than other groups. We all celebrated the decline in stroke mortality. Stroke went from being number 2 to number 3, all the way back to number 5. But if you really disentangle the data, you'll see that among African-American women, there's actually been a slight an increase in stroke mortality. And African-American men have also seen an increase in stroke mortality. Jose Gutierrez and I analyzed about 38,000 subjects from NHANES from 2000 to 2009. Unsurprisingly, we found that compared to white individuals, stroke prevalence was greater among those with suboptimal control of their risk factors, especially hypertension and diabetes. But what is interesting is that only about 40%, according to George's data, can really be explained by these traditional risk factors. And the question is, what is responsible for the others? And how do the more upstream factors, the more upstream risk factors, interact with downstream biological mechanisms of stroke? We also know that there are lower treatment rates, and African Americans are less likely to receive acute stroke therapies. And we also know that there's poorer functional outcomes among Black stroke survivors generally compared to whites. This is another important study by the Regards Group. It's a really important study because it's actually one of the first to really show the relationship between social determinants of health, these further upstream factors, and incident stroke. And you can see the hazard ratios for those with greater than 3 social determinants of health. Low education, annual household income, and zip code poverty were also significant. And again, just showing that these upstream factors are also playing an important role in driving these disparities. And this data was adjusted for usual suspects, including income, education, et cetera. You know, we now have a formal toolkit for measuring social determinants of health. The NIMHD recommends the Phoenix toolkit, which I've started using in my studies. It's a huge toolkit with multiple domains and multiple constructs, but it is very comprehensive, and it uses a lot of validated instruments to measure as measures in this toolkit. So for all of you interested in doing research, looking at social determinants of health, I recommend the Phoenix toolkit. And so for the last part of this talk, I just want to talk a little bit about how I target health disparities. So a lot of my work is really guided by the socio-ecological model. I try to work across the multiple levels of behavioral influence. At the societal level, I do a lot of work with the former First Lady around food equity. At the community level, I do a lot of work. I actually founded the Community Health Worker Training Center at Columbia. We work with about 52 churches in Northern Manhattan, and we've trained and certified about 146 community health workers, and we've employed about 40 of those in our shop. I also, as Ron mentioned, have an organization called Hip Hop Public Health. We developed music-based health promotion resources for children. Our most popular resource has been the physical activity break, which is now being used across 3,600 cities globally. I have several grants that really focus on prevention as well as stroke preparedness. And I'm going to talk, and as well as mental health. And I'm going to talk a little bit about hip hop stroke, which really is the one that started the journey for me in this area. So education is a major social determinant of health and mediator of health disparities. If you look at the National Academy of Medicine's report, they were really quite, they elegantly described it and demonstrated how these health literacy interventions can really help reduce health disparities as well as foster health equity and social justice. A lot of the work that I've focused on over the years has really been focused on health literacy and health behaviors. And so we develop health literacy interventions, and we have a model that incorporates science, culture, and art across the multiple socioeconomic levels of behavioral influence. We conduct efficacy trials, effectiveness trials, and then we can conduct hybrid effectiveness implementation trials ranging from type 1 all the way through type 3 to test our interventions. We have a transdisciplinary team that includes kids and artists and musicians and public health experts. It's a very colorful group. We come together as one unit to develop our interventions. Art, culture, and science are really the pillars of our interventions. Within the art domain, we focus a lot on music as a tool, as an intervention tool. In the culture domain, we do a lot of work around community engagement. We use cultural adaptation frameworks. I like to use the ecological validity model. And in the science domain, in addition to the usual rigor, we put a lot of premium on message science. We believe that music, especially for the population that we target and the age that we target, we believe that music is a very important tool, intervention tool, and the music interventions across the spectrum of health, but we use music to address health literacy. We know that music has significant real estate in our brains. We know that it enhances self-awareness and circuits involved in focused thought. We know about its effect on affect, its effect on attitudes. We know about the way it enhances memory and retention. Just think of how we all learned our ABCs through song. We know about music's ability to reduce stress, and we know about the inspirational value of music. I like to listen to the Rocky song when I'm on the treadmill, for example. Cultural adaptation is also really important. I cannot emphasize this enough. It requires cultural engagement. There are many different ways to engage communities, and unfortunately, I don't have enough time to talk about all of those. But it's important to know that the multiple adaptations for a specific cultural group are much more effective than interventions that only have a few adaptations. So the more adaptations, the more the efficacy, which is why we like using the ecological validity model, because it contains 8 elements for adaptation, ranging from the language all the way through the context that the intervention is trying to address. With regards to message science, we focus on kids. So within our kids approach, we We know that implementation intentions is an effective approach when targeting children. It really involves creating an if-then plan. If situation A occurs, then the kid will do X behavior. We also build in the theory of reasoned action to support our implementation intentions approach. With regards to message stickiness and contagiousness, we like to use the success model by Dan Health and Chip Health that really breaks down messages into simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, and emotionally connecting to enhance stickiness and to enhance contagiousness. It breaks it down into the type of social currency that message has to generate, as well as the practical value and the emotional connectedness of the message. So we really develop our messages carefully, guided by these models. We also believe that children are wonderful targets for multiple reasons. One, we can try to influence the arc of risk factor acquisition as they grow older by teaching them early habits, healthy habits. We also think that through this model that we developed called child-mediated health communication, that children can influence not only the knowledge of their parents and their grandparents, but they can influence the behaviors of their parents and their grandparents. And we have some studies out that have demonstrated that, yes, using children as proximal targets and conduits into the homes to intervene on parents and grandparents is an effective approach. And we've seen this not only with knowledge acquisition, but we've also seen it with parental behavior change. Hip hop stroke is really a stroke literacy intervention designed to increase 911 calls when a stroke is being witnessed. The goal really was to have children teach parents about the signs and symptoms and actions around stroke. When a stroke occurs in their home, the importance of calling 911, but we've had some very interesting results along the journey, some of which I will share. For those of you who haven't seen the hip hop stroke video, I'll just show a brief clip.
Show. Now if he don't sound right, then he's doing the show. Sway when he walks, then he's doing the show. Slur when he talk, then he's doing the show. Call 911, cause it ain't no joke. Now F is for the face, and A is for the arms, F is for the speech, and T is for the time. Time to do what? Call 911. Time to do what? Call 911. F is for the face, and A is for the arms, F is for the speech, and T is for the time. Time to do what? Call 911. And that's the way that the stroke is done. Come on. Everywhere
this is a class in the Bronx doing the hip hop stroke program. It's an online program and the teachers love it because it gives them a break. Click on this. You see how engaged the kids are in the content. They're learning a tremendous amount at the same time. This is a child in Nashville where we also have a lot of schools.
So the F means that when your face gets droopy,
Yeah,
and your face get like kind of all mixed up, like it's kind of like twisted.
yeah.
And then what was it? The A meant that your arm or one side of your body get droopy and you can't really walk and stuff.
Yeah.
And you like kind of like drop down.
Yep.
And then the S means that your words get all mixed together and stuff,
Yep.
and that you can't really talk. And then the T means that it's time to call the police.
Awesome. Thank you.
And so we initially rolled out hip hop stroke in Harlem. There are 12 schools in central Harlem that were serviced by Harlem Hospital. We saturated the program in those schools. And we had a baseline thrombolytic administration about 1.9%. We tracked our thrombolytic rates after the intervention was administered. We captured exposure by interviewing all stroke patients that came into the hospital, whether they were exposed to a child who participated in hip hop stroke. Now, this was just a quasi-experimental trial. It wasn't done particularly rigorously, but it did give us a signal, and because we did find a lot of patients who came into the hospital who came in early to the hospital did have children who were exposed to our intervention. We, based on the data from our hip hop stroke trial, where we randomized 3,000 kids and 1,000 parents, and we found not only that these kids could transfer the information, a number of kids were actually calling 911, a number of parents who had kids exposed to the intervention were calling 911. We had dramatic increases in stroke literacy at the parent level, even though we didn't intervene directly on them. Ultimately, the New York State Department of Health decided to include a hip hop stroke as one of the options for the educational activity that goes towards the public education component with the annual stroke accreditation. We now have 42 participating New York State stroke centers who are using hip hop stroke in their local catchment schools, and we're really excited by this as well as the national scale of strokes. The program is now in about 11 cities across the country. And I just want to end with this child who saved, who called 911 for his father.
I wake up to go and use the bathroom to pee, and I find myself next to the bathtub. I feel that little electricity coming down, and everything stopped.
I was worried. I didn't know what to do. Then I remembered what the hip hop stroke told me, and then I did it. If you see someone that has blurry vision and their arm gets weak and they have a really bad headache, call 911.
Daniel, I think because of his knowledge, he knew what the right step to do, call 911. I probably would be more panicky, but they gave me strength from how they behave and how they spoke to the 911 operator. It gives you a second chance in life, because I probably would have lost him.
So I just want to thank so many people to thank. At Columbia, I have a big research team. Really, they deserve all the credit for this work. My data coordinating center at Hebrew Home, NYU, my collaborators at NYU and University of South Florida, Hip Hop Public Health, and the wonderful artists that have supported our efforts over the years, as well as the CTSA here at Columbia. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jide, for an incredibly important talk. And it is clear there are no more excuses for failure to do things. So I would encourage people to put questions into the chat so that we could address them. And I'll ask the first question, and that is, how often do you find it that there's actually awareness of risk and there is knowledge, but a failure of engagement?
That's a great question, Ron, because I think that is a big challenge, because if you look at hypertension, African Americans actually are more aware of hypertension than anybody else, and yet they are the least controlled. And so, in many cases, it's not just awareness. So there's certain conditions like stroke, for example, that awareness plays a bigger role because of the time-sensitive nature and then having awareness of treatment. But for a lot of risk factors, there's good awareness, Ron. The problem is health-seeking behaviors, and that in turn is driven by a complex, issues around trust and cost, and familiarity and comfort level, and just prior poor experiences in the past with the health system. But yes, health-seeking behavior is a big part, but there are barriers to health-seeking behaviors that we need to consider also, and a lot of those are linked to structural racism.
Now, I'm thinking, among other things, obesity, because I can tell you now, living in the South for 4 years, obesity is just staggering. And if you talk to people about that, they acknowledge it, but yet little is done to get them involved in changing lifestyle.
So that you've emphasized the goal is really control. We need to do a better job with controlling risk factors. But the problem with control is that control is governed by a whole host of social determinants. And unless we address the social determinants that create barrier, either cognitive barriers or environmental and physical barriers to control, we'll never address control. It's not as simple as prescribing a pill. There are so many interacting factors that affect compliance to that pill or access to that pill.
George, you want to elaborate on your point in the chat?
It's amazing how small that button is. No, today I was just completely agreeing with you. It's not only are African Americans more likely to be aware of their hypertension, but among those who have hypertension and aware of it, African Americans are much more likely to be treated. And actually the compliance is good. Their compliance is as good or better than their white counterparts. You hit the nail on the head. It's the control of hypertension. And I'll add, by the way, which I think is equally important, the prevention of hypertension. I think if we're really going to solve the Black-white disparity in stroke, it's going to require the bold attitude that what we need to do is reduce the disparity in the incidence of hypertension. Perhaps the best way to control hypertension is to prevent it.
I should also say, thanks. I mean, we recently concluded a trial. We're trying to get it published now with Benga Ogedegbe, and we randomized patients to home blood pressure telemonitoring alone versus home blood pressure telemonitoring plus a nurse case manager. And in the home blood pressure, these are African American and Hispanic stroke survivors with uncontrolled hypertension. In the home blood pressure telemonitoring arm, we had and we had great retention, 80%. We had over the 5 years. In the home blood pressure telemonitoring arm, we had a 5% reduction in systolic blood pressure on average. When we added the nurse case manager, we had a 15-point reduction in hypertension, in systolic blood pressure. Again, why is it that just the addition of a nurse case manager can result in such a large effect size? And these are some of the systems approaches that we can incorporate to help control hypertension more effectively.
To the point about nurses, they spend the time talking and listening. And a lot of the time, unfortunately, many physicians, because of regulatory things, they're very busy. They don't take the time to do that. And so I think there's often greater trust with these other members of the healthcare system than the traditional physician. And I think we need to engage them more, these intermediaries, healthcare champions, to be able to educate and to monitor. So Dr. Clark, can you tell us a little bit about the Groundwater Institute?
Yeah, sure. So it is actually a partnership between make sure I got my partnerships right. The Racial Equity Institute and Impactive. And actually, they have a 5-day training course, and they have it open now for people in medicine. So I was able to actually interact with people, all sides of medicine, not just us that provide care, but people in higher ups and insurance companies. But they have the groundwater approach, and similar to what you were saying, Dr. Williams, we understand that, again, what we're seeing are just symptoms of systemic issues. So they went from the root to the actual groundwater, the groundwater being the actual federal systems that have been put in place since the inception of the United States. And we know that race is actually a social construct, has nothing to do with biology. And then from there, you have kind of the lakes and the ponds, which are your community. And then you have the fish, which is the individual. And a lot of things that healthcare has tried to change really make it a problem with the fish when it's not really the individual. Yes, we have things that as individuals we can control, but when we're really talking about healthcare disparities and these inequities, it is truly a groundwater issue. So we can't rely on the fish fixing the problem for the fish. We have to really infiltrate the water and clean it up so that as trees grow, as plants grow, it'll be able to be more equitable.
So thank you. Dr. Grope, we only have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Can you elaborate on how stroke centers have been involved in hip hop stroke and other programs?
But first I want to say, Amber's comment was right on, and I think it gets to, and I just love the analogy with talking about the ACEs and the tree, because really we have to approach this from kind of ground zero from the start and think about the broader context. Having said that, because I have more control over what might happen with stroke centers, and even though this is way downstream, we're putting out fires, right? By the time people are having their symptoms, they've gone through a lifetime of ACEs and other events, right? That you outlined so well. I was interested in hearing more about the involvement in stroke centers, and I'm trying to organize systems here in Alabama, and one way to do that is to use the leverage what we know, what we're doing with the stroke centers, to try to get more community level engagement. And so tell me about those things.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and I just want to thank Amber for that analogy of groundwater. Again, it's the tree and the soil, right? And we have to address the soil if we want a tree to thrive. But we work, so the hip hop stroke is available for anyone, anywhere. It's simply, we like to work directly with stroke coordinators. And so the stroke coordinator can send us an email. It's hiphopstroke.org. If you go to the website, you can just send us an email through the site to request the program. And then there are training materials, simple training materials. And the goal would be really for the stroke coordinator to engage local schools and help facilitate setting up the program. We have staff on site that will support the stroke coordinator through the setting up part. Then after that, the school gets an identifier that enables the kids to log on, and the kids get a unique identifier that enables them to log on. So we can identify schools and individual kids for those who want to participate in the research. But there's another way to access it that has no data collection, and that's just, it makes the program available for anyone who wants to participate. So if you go to hiphopstroke.org and send us an email, we can certainly work with you in Alabama.
I think you'll probably be hearing from Tammy Davis, our manager for our stroke, our regional coordinating center for StrokeNet. I have a feeling you're going to get an email.
Great.
Tammy, I don't know if you want to say hello, but she was very inspired by your talk as well, I know.
It was a great talk, and I actually have formed out my little plan to come with our school. So we appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
So Jide, I want to thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. It's given us a lot to think about. I also want to thank Vicki Hickson, our McKnight administrator, who puts all this together. Without this, this just wouldn't happen.